Sejanus. He wasn't born into nobility. He didn't inherit a throne or command a legion on a battlefield. Lucius Aelius Sejanus, born around 20 BC in the Etruscan town of Volsini, came from an equestrian family. Respectable, but nowhere near the gilded halls of imperial Rome. And yet, within a single generation, this man would come closer to seizing the Roman Empire through shadow and manipulation than almost anyone in history. Sejanus was the most feared operative of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the very dynasty that gave Rome its first emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, a bloodline that began in 27 BC and ended in chaos when Nero took his own life in 68 AD. Sejanus rose to become the sole Praetorian prefect under Emperor Tiberius in approximately 14 AD, consolidating the command of roughly 12,000 soldiers, Rome's most elite and politically dangerous military unit, into his own two hands. Before Sejanus, those soldiers were scattered across Italy in smaller encampments, deliberately kept diffuse so they couldn't be weaponized too easily. Sejanus changed that. Around 23 AD, he persuaded Tiberius to authorize the construction of the Castra Praetoria, a single fortified garrison just outside Rome's walls on the Viminal Hill, centralizing all Praetorian cohorts into one concentrated mass of military power under his direct command. It was an architectural decision that would reshape Roman politics for centuries, because whoever controlled those soldiers controlled the empire. What made Sejanus uniquely terrifying wasn't just the power he accumulated, but the method. He operated not with a drawn blade, but with whispers. His most suspected act of violence was the elimination of Drusus Julius Caesar, Tiberius's own biological son and heir, who died in 23 AD under circumstances that left ancient historians deeply suspicious. Drusus had publicly struck Sejanus during an argument, a sign that the emperor's son recognized the threat posed by this low-born prefect, growing fat on imperial favor. Ancient sources, including Tacitus, suggest strongly that Sejanus seduced Drusus's own wife Livilla, and together they poisoned Drusus slowly, allowing the cause of death to appear natural. No blade, no blood on the floor, just a gradual, quiet exit from the succession. With Drusus gone, Sejanus turned his sights on the remaining heirs, Germanicus's sons, who still held the affection of the Roman people. He drove Tiberius into paranoia, painting Agrippina the Elder and her sons as dangerous rivals plotting against the throne. By 26 AD, Sejanus had convinced the already reclusive emperor to leave Rome entirely and retreat to his villa on the island of Capri, where Tiberius lived until his death in 37 AD. With the emperor isolated and all communication routed through Sejanus himself, the prefect effectively governed Rome. Senators bowed to him. Provincial appointments were his to give or deny. Treason trials, once rare and reserved for genuine threats, became instruments of political murder. Anyone who annoyed Sejanus could be accused of maestas, treason, and vanish from public life. In 29 AD, he successfully orchestrated the exile of Agrippina the Elder and two of her sons to various islands, from which they would never return. For years, Sejanus appeared untouchable. In 31 AD, he even shared the consulship with Tiberius himself, the closest a man of his rank had ever come to imperial legitimacy. But Tiberius, aging on Capri and fed by informants from multiple directions, slowly became aware that his right hand had grown its own ambitions. He couldn't remove Sejanus openly, not with 12,000 Praetorians loyal to the prefect, so he moved with the same quiet cunning his minister had always used. He secretly appointed a new Praetorian prefect, Naevius Sutorius Macro, and fed Sejanus false intelligence, telling him that a letter arriving from Capri would elevate him to tribunician power. The clearest signal of imperial succession. On October 18, 31 AD, Sejanus entered the Senate with his eyes bright and his head full of purple ambitions. The letter from Tiberius was read aloud. It began with vague praise, then shifted to criticism, then ended with a single instruction: arrest him. By nightfall, Sejanus had been dragged to the Tullianum, Rome's ancient stone prison, and strangled in the dark. His body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs, the steps of public shame, where crowds set upon it with such fury that almost nothing remained. Within days, every statue of Sejanus in Rome had been toppled. His name was chiseled out of stone inscriptions. His children were hunted down and executed. Even his young daughter, reportedly violated first so she wouldn't be killed as a virgin, since Roman law technically forbade executing virgins. He had come within a Senate letter of ruling the world, and then he was gone, as if he had never existed. Stephanus. The Flavian dynasty, Vespasian Titus Domitian, ruling from 69 to 96 AD, gave Rome the Colosseum, restored the city after the Great Fire, and expanded its borders. It also gave Rome one of its most controlling, surveillance-obsessed emperors, Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD and styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, though historians note he may not have officially adopted the title, with sources suggesting it was more flattery than decree. Domitian was, by most ancient accounts, a ruthless autocrat who spent the last years of his reign in a state of mutual terror with the Roman Senate, conducting purges, demanding informers, and executing men for offenses as vague as looking at him the wrong way. The historian Brian Jones described him as a ruthless but efficient administrator. His financial policies were sound, his border defenses solid, his building program impressive. But the Senate hated him, and eventually the palace hated him too. The man who ended all of it was named Stephanos. He was a freedman, a former slave, and at the time of the assassination he served as a household steward to Domitian's own niece, Flavia Domitilla. He was not a soldier, not a senator, not a trained killer of any kind. What he was, according to Suetonius's detailed account, was methodical. For several days before the attack, Stephanos walked the corridors of the imperial palace with his left arm wrapped in thick bandaging, feigning a serious injury. Beneath those bandages, concealed against his skin for days, was a dagger. He had practiced the deception long enough that no one thought twice about the bandage anymore. It was just part of how the steward looked. The conspiracy ran deeper than Stephanos alone. The chief organizer was almost certainly Parthenius, Domitian's own chamberlain, whose close colleague Epaphroditus, once Nero's freedman, had recently been executed by Domitian himself, allegedly for aiding Nero's suicide years earlier. That execution sent a message to every freedman near the throne. No past loyalty would protect them. Titus Petronius Secundus, one of the two Praetorian prefects, was almost certainly aware of the plot. The same-day proclamation of Nerva as emperor, organized with seamless speed, strongly suggests that powerful men had coordinated in advance. On September 18th, 96 AD, just 1 month before Domitian's 45th birthday, Stephanos approached the emperor with a document in hand, a written petition or report, handing it over as a pretext to get close. As Domitian began to read, Stephanos pulled back the bandage with his right hand and drove the concealed dagger into the emperor's groin with his left. What followed was not clean or swift. Domitian did not simply fall. Ancient sources, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe a violent struggle. The emperor fought back, grappling with Stephanos on the palace floor, trying to get his hands on the blade, calling for a servant boy, asking for a sword hidden in his bedroom. More conspirators entered the room and struck additional blows. Stephanos himself was stabbed by Domitian during the fight and died shortly afterward from his wounds, the assassin and his target bleeding out together on the same palace floor. When it was over, Domitian's body was carried out on a common bier, the kind used for paupers, and cremated without ceremony by his nurse Phyllis, who quietly mixed his ashes with those of his beloved niece Julia. The Senate convened the same day. By sunset, Marcus Cocceius Nerva was emperor. The Senate immediately passed Damnatio Memoriae. Every coin bearing Domitian's face was ordered melted, every arch torn down, every inscription bearing his name chiseled into smooth stone. The man who had called himself Lord and God was erased from the record in a single afternoon. And the freedman who had ended him, who had spent days walking around with a dagger against his skin, and no one the wiser, was dead too, taking the blade's secret with him to the funeral pyre. Narcissus. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty, stretching from 96 to 192 AD, is generally remembered as Rome's golden age. The five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, who gave the empire its greatest territorial extent, its most stable governance, and what Edward Gibbon would later call the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. That run ended when Marcus Aurelius broke from the adoptive succession tradition and left the throne to his biological son Commodus, who was born in 161 AD and would prove to be everything his father was not. Commodus took sole power in 180 AD and rapidly became, by all ancient accounts, a spectacle of narcissism and instability on a throne-sized stage. He renamed Rome itself, the eternal city of millions, Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, meaning it was now his colony, his personal possession. He renamed all 12 months of the year after himself, or his various titles. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, commissioning statues of himself draped in a lion's skin with a club in hand, and forced senators to watch as he walked into the Colosseum to fight. Not real gladiatorial combat, but staged bouts against weakened or cooperative opponents, of which Cassius Dio records over 700 fights, all of which Commodus won, sometimes killing live animals including 5 hippopotami, and dozens of leopards in a single day. He was immensely popular with the crowds. He was terrifying to everyone around him. By late 192 AD, 3 people very close to Commodus had discovered their own names on a list of individuals the emperor intended to execute: Marcia, his mistress; Eclectus, his chamberlain; and Quintus Aemilius Latus, the praetorian prefect. These were the people who kept him fed, kept him safe, managed his affairs, and slept under the same roof. When Marcia found that list, the decision was instant and unanimous. They needed someone they could trust in the emperor's private chambers, someone whose presence there at an odd hour would raise no questions. That was Narcissus. He was Commodus's personal wrestling partner and trainer, a professional athlete who had spent his professional life building the physical capability to grapple with Rome's most powerful man on a daily basis. His access to the emperor during private training sessions was complete and unquestioned. Nobody thought twice about Narcissus being near Commodus. The plan unfolded on the final night of December 192 AD, New Year's Eve, the last night of the year Commodus intended to begin, as tradition, by appearing publicly as a gladiator and naming himself as the 2 consuls for the new year. First, Marcia poisoned his food. Commodus consumed the dose, but then vomited it back up, either from prior excess of drinking or simply bad timing. The poison didn't hold. With the clock running and the emperor still breathing, the conspirators had to escalate. Marcia admitted Narcissus into the imperial bedchamber. Commodus was lying in his bath, or his bed, sources differ, with Cassius Dio saying the bath and Herodian saying the bed. In a half-conscious, probably still nauseated state, Narcissus walked in as he had countless times before, and strangled him. The man who had renamed Rome after himself and fought hundreds of fake gladiatorial bouts died at the hands of his own wrestling coach, strangled in his bath on New Year's Eve at the age of 31. The Senate's response was immediate and jubilant. They declared Commodus a public enemy, voted for damnatio memoria, and ordered his statues demolished. His body was quietly buried in the mausoleum of Hadrian. The months were renamed back to their original forms. Colonia Commodiana became Rome again. Narcissus did not survive long. He was executed during the brutal civil wars of the year of the 5 emperors that followed almost immediately. The man who had killed Rome's most self-aggrandizing emperor was gone within months, but the deed had already altered the empire's course. And in a strange footnote to history, the fictional general Maximus Decimus Meridius in the 2000 film Gladiator, played by Russell Crowe, who defeats and kills a fictionalized Commodus in the Colosseum, was partly based on Narcissus. The wrestler who killed the emperor in real life was reimagined as the general who killed him on screen, an irony that would have probably amused the Roman crowds who watched the real Commodus perform, and knew, even then, that the whole thing was fake. Julius Martialis. The Severan dynasty began in blood and ended in blood, which was more or less the theme of everything it touched. Septimius Severus seized power in 193 AD after the chaos of the year of the 5 emperors, founded a dynasty that would last until 235 AD, and set a precedent for military emperors who ruled by force rather than Senate consent. His son Caracalla, born Lucius Septimius Bassianus in 188 AD, renamed Marcus Aurelius Antoninus as a propaganda move to link the Severans to the beloved Antonine dynasty, killed his own brother Geta in December 211 AD, within months of their father's death, ordering praetorian soldiers to cut Geta down while he bled in their mother's arms. That set the tone for what followed. Caracalla's reign was characterized by violence, paranoia, military excess, and one genuinely significant act, the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 AD, which extended Roman citizenship to every free man in the empire, a sweeping reform that remains his most durable legacy. He was also notorious for the massacre of Alexandria's male population, thousands killed in a single brutal reprisal, and for spending so lavishly on military pay raises that he gutted the imperial treasury. By 217 AD, Caracalla was in the eastern provinces near Carrhae, the very site where Rome had suffered one of its most catastrophic military defeats in 53 BC, when Crassus lost 20,000 soldiers to the Parthians, preparing a new campaign. Among his senior staff was his praetorian prefect, a sharp-minded lawyer and administrator from Mauritania named Marcus Apellius Macrinus. And then came the prophecy. Ancient sources tell us that 2 separate predictions had reached Caracalla warning him that Macrinus would one day depose and succeed him. Caracalla's response was classically dangerous. He gave Macrinus more honors, but quietly began reducing his power, and he sent letters to Rome inquiring about charges that might be leveled against him. One of those letters was intercepted, or at least Macrinus learned of its implications through some channel. The precise mechanism is lost, and the prefect realized that the emperor's axe was swinging toward his neck. Macrinus needed Caracalla dead. He found his instrument in a man named Julius Martialis, a soldier already embedded in the emperor's personal retinue. Two versions of Martialis' motive exist. Cassius Dio says Caracalla had refused to promote him to the rank of centurion, while Herodian says Caracalla had had Martialis' brother executed on fabricated charges just days earlier. Either way, Martialis was not a man who needed much convincing to hate the emperor. On April 8th, 217 AD, Caracalla and a small escort rode out from their camp near Edessa to visit a famous temple of the moon, god Sin, at Cari. During the journey, the emperor halted by the roadside to relieve himself. Standard protocol, his bodyguard stepped back several paces to give the emperor some privacy, as they always did. Julius Martialis approached, as though he had something to say or deliver. The guards didn't think twice. He was one of them, a recognized face in the imperial entourage. As Caracalla stood exposed and distracted, Martialis drove a concealed blade into his back. The emperor fell. Martialis ran. He was cut down within seconds by Caracalla's mounted bodyguards, killed before he could reach any real distance from the body. His usefulness to Macrinus now complete, and his silence permanently guaranteed. According to Cassius Dio, other retainers loyal to Macrinus quietly finished off Caracalla where he had fallen, ensuring the wound was fatal rather than merely severe. Rome's most feared emperor in a generation died mid-urination by a dusty road in the eastern provinces, stabbed from behind by a man he likely barely knew by name. He was 29 years old. Macrinus was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers on April 11th, just 3 days later, a speed that, to the ancient sources, spoke volumes about prior arrangement. He became the first non-senatorial emperor in Roman history, a man of North African equestrian origin who reached the throne not through bloodline or Senate nomination, but through a blade wielded by someone else. His reign lasted exactly 14 months before the Severan dynasty, through the machinations of Caracalla's formidable aunt Julia Maesa, reasserted itself in the form of the teenage Elagabalus. As for Julius Martialis, cut down within seconds of the kill, he left no record of his own words. No reported last statement, no known burial. He was used, deployed, and disposed of with the same cold efficiency that Macrinus had applied to imperial politics throughout his career. The most consequential dagger blow of the Severan era was struck by a man history barely remembers, for reasons history can't quite agree on, in a moment of pure, unglamorous roadside violence that ended one dynasty's most notorious son and launched another man's brief, doomed empire. Locusta, she didn't carry a blade. She didn't need to be in the room when it happened. She didn't even need to watch. Locusta, no family name survives, no birthplace is certain beyond a vague reference to Gaul in ancient sources, was Rome's most professionally accomplished poisoner, a woman who turned the chemistry of death into a career so indispensable to the imperial court that emperors kept her alive, specifically because killing her would mean losing access to what she knew. She operated during the reigns of Claudius and Nero, the final two emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and her hands, or rather her formulas, touched two of the most consequential deaths of that entire bloodline. Ancient sources including Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio mention her by name, without any apparent surprise that such a person existed and was employed by the palace, which says something worth sitting with about what the imperial court had quietly normalized by the middle of the 1st century AD. The first death she is most credibly connected to is that of the Emperor Claudius himself, who died on October 13th, 54 AD at the age of 63, after a reign of 13 years. Claudius was, by most accounts, a more capable administrator than his physical infirmities, and the contempt of his own family allowed him to appear. He had conquered Britain, reformed the imperial bureaucracy, extended citizenship, and survived long enough in a dynasty that murdered its members with casual frequency to suggest he was considerably shrewder than his enemies credited him. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, niece, then wife, and by any reasonable reading the most politically gifted woman of her generation, had her own timeline. She had a son from a previous marriage named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom Claudius had adopted and renamed Nero, and she needed Claudius dead before he could change his mind about the succession in favor of his own biological son Britannicus, who was approaching the age at which he could be formally presented to the legions and the Senate as a legitimate heir. Timing was everything. Ancient sources, particularly Tacitus, report that Agrippina employed Locusta to prepare the poison, which was then administered by a man named Halotus, Claudius's food taster and eunuch according to some sources, or by Agrippina herself via a dish of mushrooms according to others, with Tacitus suggesting the mushrooms as the vehicle and the physician Xenophon as a possible accomplice, who administered a second dose via feather down Claudius's throat under the pretense of helping him vomit. The mechanics are disputed in ways that will never be fully resolved. What is not disputed is that Claudius died that night, that Nero was presented to the Praetorian Guard the following morning and acclaimed emperor before the Senate could organize an alternative, and that Locusta's formula had done what it was designed to do: create a death that looked plausible enough to buy the hours needed for succession to be locked in place. Nero's accession did not free Locusta. It made her more essential. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, now a 13-year-old living in the palace under the reign of his adopted brother, was a problem that had not gone away simply because his father was dead. He was still the bloodline heir, still beloved by certain factions, still capable of becoming a rallying point for anyone who found Nero's reign inconvenient. At a dinner in early 55 AD, Nero had Britannicus's drink tested for poison by a taster as protocol demanded. Then, when it came back too hot, had cold water added to cool it, water into which the poison had already been introduced, so the taster's test was rendered meaningless. Britannicus drank, convulsed almost immediately, and died at the table. The other dinner guests froze. Nero, according to Tacitus, calmly remarked that it was an epileptic episode, and that Britannicus had always suffered from them, and encouraged everyone to continue eating. Agrippina, sitting at the same table, reportedly went pale, not from grief for Britannicus, whom she had been willing to set aside for her own ambitions, but from the sudden recognition that the son she had made emperor was capable of eliminating inconvenient people without consulting her first. That dinner was the beginning of the end of Agrippina's influence over Nero. For Locusta, it was a moment of both professional triumph and personal precariousness, because Nero had reportedly been furious that a first attempt at poisoning Britannicus had failed, dragging Locusta before him personally and threatening her with execution until she produced a formula fast-acting enough to satisfy him, which she then tested on animals, then on a slave, before it was considered ready for the dining table. What made Locusta remarkable in the ancient record is not merely that she poisoned people for emperors, but that she survived doing it as long as she did. She had been arrested and was awaiting execution for poisoning crimes when Agrippina's people first brought her into the palace's service. Her expertise was, in the most literal sense, the thing that kept her alive. Nero granted her a formal pardon, gave her estates, gave her students to teach in what Suetonius describes as something close to a school of poisoning, and treated her with the kind of protected status usually reserved for people who knew too much to be safely discarded. She was, functionally, a state asset. When Nero's own reign collapsed in 68 AD and he fled Rome, abandoned by the Praetorians and declared a public enemy by the Senate, ultimately dying by his own hand with the help of his freedman Epaphroditus in a villa outside the city, the protection that had kept Locusta alive evaporated with him. Galba, who succeeded Nero as emperor and immediately set about making enemies faster than even Nero had managed, had Locusta executed in early 69 AD, paraded through the city first, according to some sources, before being put to death. The dynasty she had served, the family whose succession she had chemically enforced, was finished. The Julio-Claudian line that had begun with Augustus in 27 BC had ended with the emperor she helped put on the throne, and the woman who had poisoned her way through its final chapter went to her death in the chaos that followed. One more body in the wreckage of a dynasty that had always consumed the people most useful to it. She left no writings, no formula, no school that survived her. Just two dead emperor's sons, one adopted, one biological, and a name that ancient historians mentioned without ceremony, as though a professional poisoner on imperial retainer was simply one of those things Rome had gotten around to normalizing, without anyone quite deciding to. Brutus. Before there were emperors to kill, there were kings to fear, or the memory of kings, which in Rome amounted to the same thing. The Romans had expelled their last king, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BC, and the trauma of that monarchy had calcified into something close to religious doctrine over the 5 centuries that followed. The Republic was sacred, the Senate was sovereign, and any man who reached too far toward one-man rule was not merely a political threat, but a kind of blasphemy against the Roman idea itself. It was into this ideological inheritance that Marcus Junius Brutus was born, around 85 BC, into a family that carried the weight of that doctrine like a surname. His ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus was, according to Roman tradition, the very man who had led the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus and co-founded the Republic. That lineage was not background noise. It was a script, and Brutus knew every line of it. He was also, by the time of the late Republic's final convulsions, a man of genuine intellectual distinction, a student of philosophy, a writer of considerable reputation, a man whom Cicero, not an easy man to impress, respected as among the finest minds of his generation, and he was a close personal friend of Gaius Julius Caesar, which made everything that followed considerably more complicated than a simple story about tyranny and virtue tends to allow. Caesar, by 44 BC, had crossed every line the Republic had drawn. He had marched his army across the Rubicon in 49 BC, triggering civil war. He had defeated Pompey, the Senate's champion, and the armies of the old Republican order at Pharsalus in 48 BC, at Zala in 47 BC, and at Thapsus in 46 BC, and Munda in 45 BC in campaigns so swift and so total that the resistance had simply run out of bodies. He had been appointed Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, in February 44 BC, an office the Republic had designed as a temporary emergency measure and that Caesar had just made permanent. He had placed his own image on coins during his lifetime, something no Roman had done before. He had been offered a crown at the Lupercalia festival in February 44 BC by Mark Antony, and had refused it 3 times, according to Plutarch, each refusal greeted by cheers, which told the watching Senate that the crowd would have cheered if he'd accepted it too. The men who organized the conspiracy against him numbered around 60, which is remarkable as a feat of secrecy in a city full of informants, and the 2 names history has attached most firmly to the plot are Gaius Cassius Longinus and Brutus. Cassius was the engine, ambitious, resentful of Caesar on deeply personal grounds. Caesar had given a command post Cassius believed he deserved to Brutus instead, and convinced that the Republic was genuinely dying and that only a blade could save it. Brutus was the name. The conspirators knew that without Brutus, the assassination could be framed as a power grab by jealous rivals. With Brutus, who was famous for his integrity and his republican lineage, it could be framed as a principled act of liberation. Cassius recruited him carefully, reportedly having anonymous notes placed near Brutus's tribunal that read things like, "Brutus, are you sleeping?" and "You are not the real Brutus." They were pushing on a door that may have already been open. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, the conspirators arrived at the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting temporarily while the Curia was being renovated. Caesar was warned not to come that day. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death. A haruspice named Spurina had warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March, and that morning additional bad omens had accumulated. Caesar dismissed them all, reportedly saying that he preferred to die suddenly and without warning. One more warning arrived at the last moment. A man named Artemidorus pressed a written note directly into Caesar's hand as he walked to the Senate, a note that named the conspirators. Caesar kept it, unread, intending to read it later. He never got to later. Inside the meeting, a senator named Tillius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition, requesting the recall of his exiled brother, and as Caesar began to refuse, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it down. The signal. Casca, standing behind Caesar, struck the first blow with a dagger, wounding him in the neck. Caesar grabbed Casca's arm, reportedly saying in Latin, "Why, you villain, what is this?" Then the others closed in. All 60 of them, pressing forward in a confined space, some wounding each other in the chaos. 23 wounds in total, according to the physician Antistius's later examination, only one of which was lethal, a stab to the chest. Caesar covered his face and pulled his toga down over his legs as he fell, so that even in dying he maintained dignity. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue. The immortal words, "Et tu, Brute," were reported by Shakespeare, but ancient sources give varying accounts of Caesar's final words. Suetonius says he said nothing after the initial cry, while others report a Greek phrase meaning something like, "You too, child." Whether Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son, as rumor ancient and modern has sometimes suggested, is unknowable. What is clear is that whatever Caesar saw in Brutus's face as the blades went in, it was the thing that made him stop fighting and pull his toga up over his face. The aftermath was not the liberation the conspirators had imagined. The Roman crowd was not grateful. It was frightened, and then, after Mark Antony read Caesar's will publicly and revealed he had left money to every Roman citizen, furious. The conspirators fled. Brutus and Cassius were eventually declared enemies of the state. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, their combined forces were defeated by the armies of Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heir and grandnephew, the future Augustus, in 2 engagements separated by 3 weeks. Cassius, believing the first battle lost when it was not yet fully decided, ordered his own freedmen to kill him with the same sword he had used on Caesar. Brutus survived that first engagement but lost the second, and when it was clear his army was broken and his cause finished, he fell on his own sword, assisted by a friend named Strato, who held it steady, while Brutus ran onto the blade. Mark Antony wrapped Brutus's body in his own purple cloak, according to Plutarch, and had him cremated with honor, acknowledging even in death that Brutus had genuinely believed what he was doing was right. Octavian reportedly sent Brutus's severed head back to Rome to be placed at the foot of Caesar's statue, though some sources dispute this. The republic Brutus died to save was already gone before his body was cold. The man who couldn't bear to watch Rome become a monarchy handed it to the greatest monarch it would ever produce, a 20-year-old named Octavian who had learned, watching everything that had happened, exactly how not to look like a king while becoming one. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.